Welcome, dear viewers. For more exclusive, thrilling stories every week, join our membership. Sit back, relax, and sip your coffee. Enjoy. People see Washington wineries and think of sunny days and happy toasts. That's the daytime story. But when the gates close and the shadows in the old cellar grow long, this place shows another side. I came here to work with wine, simple as that. But you quickly understand, the land itself demands certain considerations. Things you just do, especially after dark. It's not about the wine, not really. It's about what's always been here, beneath the vines. My name's Trevor Haskell. And 6 months ago, I was washing dishes at a Denny's in Spokane, dreaming of something better. Anything better. My girlfriend Cassie had just moved out, taking half my stuff and all my motivation with her. I was scrolling through job postings at 2 a.m. when I found it. Cellar hand position, immediate start, housing provided, apply today. The listing was for Ravens Hollow Estate, tucked away in the Horse Heaven Hills south of Prosser. I'd never heard of the place, which seemed odd since I grew up around here. But the pay was decent, and they were offering a studio apartment above the tasting room. After 3 years of splitting rent on a moldy duplex, the idea of my own space felt like winning the lottery. The drive from Spokane took me through the Palouse, those rolling golden hills giving way to sagebrush and basalt cliffs as I headed toward the Columbia River. Ravens Hollow sat at the end of a gravel road that wound through 30 acres of Cabernet vines, their leaves already turning amber in the October chill. The main building looked like someone had tried to recreate a Tuscan villa, but ran out of money halfway through. Cream-colored stucco walls rose from a foundation of river rock, topped with red clay tiles that had seen better decades. The tasting room occupied the ground floor, while my new home waited upstairs. A cramped but clean studio with a kitchenette and a view of the fermentation tanks. My boss, Elena Vasquez, met me that first afternoon. She was maybe 45, with calloused hands and the kind of tan that comes from years of vineyard work. Her handshake could crack walnuts. "You ever work harvest before?" she asked, leading me toward the production facility. "Not exactly, but I'm a fast learner." She stopped walking and fixed me with a stare that seemed to weigh more than just my work experience. "This isn't about learning fast, Trevor. It's about listening. Really listening. There are ways we do things here. Old ways. They might seem strange at first, but they keep everyone safe." The production building squatted behind the main house like a concrete bunker. Inside, stainless steel tanks reached toward exposed rafters, while oak barrels lined the walls in neat rows. Everything smelled of fermentation. Yeast and grape must mixing with something earthier, older. "Tomorrow morning, 7 sharp," Elena said, handing me a folded sheet of paper. "Read this tonight. Read it again in the morning. And Trevor?" She paused at the door. "Some of the old-timers around here will tell you stories about this place, about the family that owned it before us. Don't dismiss them as local gossip. Sometimes stories carry truth, even when they sound like nonsense." That night, alone in my studio, I unfolded the paper. At the top, in neat handwriting, someone had written, "Ravens Hollow Estate, Cellar Protocols." Below that, a list of 12 numbered items that would change everything. I spread the paper across my tiny kitchen table, the overhead bulb casting harsh light across the handwritten words. The paper felt older than it should have, edges soft with handling. Ravens Hollow Estate, Cellar Protocols. 1. Never enter Tank Room C between 11 p.m. and 4 a.m. The door will be locked for good reason. 2. If you hear children laughing in the barrel room after sunset, continue your work. Do not investigate. 3. The red emergency phone in the break room connects to Elena only. Use it if you see anyone in the cellars who doesn't belong. 4. During malolactic fermentation, typically November to January, taste wine samples only between 6 a.m. and 6 p.m. 5. If the temperature gauge on tank 7 reads below 32 degrees Fahrenheit, leave the building immediately and call Elena. 6. The old root cellar beneath the barrel room is off limits. The door stays locked. 7. If you smell roses in the cellars, especially near the old equipment, find Elena or leave for the day. 8. Never work alone after 10 p.m. Always have a partner present. 9. The vintner's tools in the glass case are display only. Do not touch them, even for emergency repairs. 10. If the building's lights go out, use only the red emergency flashlights. White light attracts unwanted attention. 11th. Document any unusual odors, sounds, or temperature changes in the daily log. Elena reviews it each morning. 12. Trust your instincts. If something feels wrong, it probably is. Leave and return during daylight hours. I read through the list 3 times, waiting for some kind of explanation that never came. What kind of winery needed rules about emergency phones and staying away from certain rooms at night? The children laughing part made my stomach twist. This was wine country, not some haunted house attraction. But I needed this job. The next morning, Elena found me hauling hoses between the tanks. September had been warm, and the Cabernet grapes were coming in with high sugar content. Perfect for fermentation, she explained, testing samples with a refractometer. You read the protocols? She asked, not looking up from her equipment. Yeah, some of them seem specific. They are. She straightened, wiping her hands on a wine-stained towel. This estate has been making wine since 1887. The Ravenscroft family built it, worked it for 4 generations. They learned things about this land that we still follow today. What kind of things? Elena gestured toward the old section of the building, where heavy wooden doors marked storage areas that predated the modern tanks. The Ravenscrofts documented everything: harvest dates, fermentation temperatures, but also other observations, patterns they noticed, rules that kept their workers safe and their wine profitable. She led me past Tank 7, a stainless steel giant that hummed with cooling systems. The temperature gauge read a steady 75 degrees Fahrenheit. This tank has given us trouble before. Something about the foundation underneath. The concrete stays cold, even in summer. Cold enough to freeze? Once? Her expression darkened. Lost an entire vintage of Merlot. 5,000 gallons ruined overnight. But we learned to watch for signs. We walked deeper into the building, past rows of French oak barrels aging the previous year's harvest. The air grew thicker here, heavy with the earthy smell of wine and something else. Something that reminded me of wet soil after rain. Tank room C, Elena said, pointing to a heavy door marked with faded red paint. Off limits during the hours listed. No exceptions. What's in there? Old fermentation equipment, wooden vats from the original winery. They're not structurally sound anymore, but the Ravenscrofts never threw anything away. Family tradition. The lock on the door looked new, a heavy deadbolt that seemed excessive for storage. As we passed, I heard something from inside, a soft creaking like wood settling. But Elena didn't react, so I kept walking. She showed me the break room, a small space with a microwave, coffee maker, and that red emergency phone mounted on the wall. The handset was old-fashioned, heavy black plastic that belonged in the 1970s office. "Direct line to my house," Elena said. "Rings in my bedroom, kitchen, and workshop. Use it if you need immediate help." "What kind of help?" "The kind that can't wait for cell service." She tapped her phone. "Signal gets spotty in the cellars. Something about the basalt bedrock." That afternoon, I worked with Miguel Santos, a veteran cellar hand who'd been at Ravens Hollow for 8 years. He was teaching me to punch down the cap on fermenting red wine, breaking up the layer of grape skins that floated to the surface. "Elena give you the protocols?" he asked, stirring the purple foam with a long steel tool. "Yeah, they seem pretty intense." Miguel paused his stirring and looked around the tank room. We were alone except for the soft bubbling of active fermentation. My first year here, I thought the same thing. Figured it was just Elena being paranoid. He resumed his work, but his voice dropped lower. Then November came. What happens in November? Malolactic fermentation starts. Different process, different bacteria, changes the whole feel of this place. He nodded toward tank room C. That's when you really understand why we have rules. "Have you ever seen anything? I mean, actually seen something that made the rules make sense?" Miguel finished with the tank and moved to clean his equipment. For a long moment, he didn't answer. Then, "Third year I was here, working late during Malo. Maybe 11:30 at night. I heard those kids Elena warns about, laughing, playing in the barrel room. Sounded so real I went to check, thinking maybe some local teenagers had broken in." He hung up the steel tool and turned to face me. Barrel room was empty, but the sound kept going, like it was coming from under the floor. The hair on my arms prickled. Under the floor? That's where the old root cellar is. Been sealed up since before Elena bought this place. Miguel gathered his cleaning supplies. I called Elena that night. Used the red phone. She showed up 15 minutes later with keys to rooms I didn't even know existed. What did she find? Nothing she shared with me. He headed toward the exit. But the next morning, she changed the locks on tank room C and added 2 more protocols to the list. As Miguel left, I found myself alone in the tank room for the first time. The building felt different now, heavier somehow, like the walls themselves were holding secrets. From somewhere deeper in the cellars, I heard that soft creaking again. Just old wood settling, I told myself, but my hands were shaking as I finished cleaning up. 3 days into the job, Elena assigned me to evening shifts. Harvest season meant 16-hour days, and someone needed to monitor the fermenting tanks through the night. The work was simple. Check temperatures every 2 hours, document any changes, and make sure the cooling systems kept running. "You'll be working with Carmen Orozco," Elena said, introducing me to a woman about my age with paint-stained fingernails and tired eyes. "She handles night documentation for the lab work." Carmen had been at Ravens Hollow for 2 years, long enough to know which floorboards creaked and where the building's quirks lived. She showed me the monitoring routine. Tank 1 through 6 in the main room, then Tank 7 standing alone near the back wall, finally the smaller experimental batches in the side area. "Tank 7's the tricky one," she said, checking her clipboard. "Temperature swings more than the others. Helena thinks it's the concrete underneath. Stays cold even when we're running heaters." We started our first round at 8 p.m. The tanks hummed with activity, fermentation creating gentle bubbles that rose through the grape must-like carbonation. Everything felt normal, productive even. Carmen chatted about her day job teaching art at Prosser High School while we recorded temperatures and checked valve settings. By 10 p.m., the building had grown quieter. The other workers had gone home, leaving just Carmen and me with the soft sounds of active winemaking. We settled into the break room for our meal break, sharing vending machine coffee and the sandwiches I'd packed. "Elena warn you about the protocols yet?" Carmen asked, stirring powdered creamer into her coffee. "Yeah, Miguel mentioned some of them too. The kids laughing thing." "Oh, you'll hear that eventually. Usually starts in October when the temperature drops." She glanced toward the barrel room. "First time scared me enough that I called Elena at midnight. She just said to keep working and ignore it." "Have you ever tried to find where it comes from?" Carmen shook her head. "Rule 2 exists for good reason. Trust me on that." At 11:45 p.m., we began our next monitoring round. The main tank room felt different now, cooler despite the heaters running at full capacity. Our breath created small clouds as we moved between the equipment. "That's weird," Carmen said, checking Tank 3's reading. Temperature dropped 4 degrees in the last 2 hours. I looked at my own thermometer reading on Tank 4. Same thing, from 78 degrees Fahrenheit down to 74 degrees Fahrenheit, despite no changes to the heating system. "Should we adjust the settings? Let's check Tank 7 first. That one usually shows problems before the others." We walked toward the back of the room, our footsteps echoing off the concrete floor. Tank 7 stood against the far wall, larger than the others and surrounded by more cooling equipment. The digital display glowed green in the dim light. 32 degrees Fahrenheit. Carmen and I stared at the reading for several seconds, neither of us speaking. The tank should have been running at 75 degrees Fahrenheit minimum. A reading of 32 degrees meant something had gone catastrophically wrong. "Rule 5, Carmen whispered. "Leave immediately and call Elena." But as we turned to go, I heard something that made me freeze. From tank room C, behind that locked red door, came the sound of liquid moving, not the gentle bubbling of fermentation, but something heavier, like water being poured from a great height. "Carmen, do you hear that?" She grabbed my arm, her fingers digging into my sleeve. "We need to leave. Now." The pouring sound grew louder, joined by what sounded like wooden barrels rolling across a floor. But tank room C was supposed to contain only old, empty equipment, nothing that should be making noise. We hurried toward the exit, but Carmen stopped at the break room to grab the red emergency phone. Her hands shook as she dialed. "Elena, it's Carmen. Tank 7 is reading 32 degrees, and we're hearing sounds from room C." She paused, listening. "Yes, we're leaving now." She hung up and grabbed her jacket. "Elena's on her way." We wait in the parking lot. Outside, the October air felt warm compared to the cellars. Carmen lit a cigarette with trembling hands while I tried to process what we'd experienced. The temperature reading made no sense. Cooling equipment couldn't malfunction that dramatically without warning alarms. "How often does this happen?" I asked. "Tank 7 problems? Maybe 3 or 4 times a year. Always at night. Always sudden." She took a long drag. "But the sounds from room C, that's new." Elma's pickup truck appeared at the end of the gravel road, headlights cutting through the darkness. She parked and approached us carrying a large flashlight and a ring of keys I had never seen before. "Tank 7 reading?" she asked without preamble. 32 degrees at 11:45, Carmen replied. Elena nodded like this confirmed something she'd expected. "And room C?" "Sounded like water pouring, maybe barrels moving around." Elena's expression grew grim. She unlocked the main building and gestured for us to follow. "Stay close. Don't touch anything I don't tell you to touch." Inside, the temperature had returned to normal. Tank 7's display now read 76 degrees Fahrenheit, as if nothing had happened. The cooling equipment hummed quietly, showing no signs of malfunction. "Check the log," Elena said, pointing Carmen toward a clipboard hanging near the tank. Carmen flipped through the pages. Temperature readings look normal. Nothing logged between our 10 p.m. check and now. Elena examined Tank 7's control panel, pressing buttons and checking digital displays. Everything appeared to function correctly, but she spent several minutes studying the concrete floor around the tank's base, running her flashlight beam across areas that looked darker than the surrounding foundation. "What are you looking for?" I asked. "Water damage. Sometimes when Tank 7 has episodes, we find moisture that shouldn't be there." She straightened up. "Nothing tonight, though." We moved toward Tank Room C. Elena produced a key from her ring and unlocked the heavy door. The space beyond was smaller than I'd expected, maybe 12 feet square, filled with wooden fermentation vats that looked like they belonged in a museum. The equipment was old but well maintained, with brass fittings and hand-carved details. "This is what you heard?" Elena asked, gesturing toward the silent vats. The room felt completely normal now. No sounds, no movement, just old wine-making equipment and storage. But something about the space made my skin crawl. Maybe the way shadows fell across the wooden surfaces, or how the air smelled different here. Not wine and fermentation, but something earthier, like soil that had never seen sunlight. "There's nothing here that could make the sounds we heard," Carmen said. "No," Elena agreed. "There isn't." She locked the door and led us back to the main tank room. "I want you both to go home. I'll finish tonight's monitoring myself." "What about the protocols?" I asked. "Rule 8 says never work alone after 10 p.m. Elena smiled, but there was no humor in it. "That rule applies to employees. I'm the owner. Different rules apply to me." As Carmen and I gathered our things, I noticed Elena pulling additional equipment from a storage closet. Devices I didn't recognize, including what looked like an old-fashioned camera with a large flash attachment. "Elena," Carmen said from the doorway, "should we be worried about coming back tomorrow?" "No. Whatever's happening here, it's not malicious. Just persistent." Elena adjusted her equipment. "The Ravenscroft family dealt with this for 90 years. We can handle one more night." Driving home, I couldn't shake the image of Tank 7's temperature reading. 32 degrees should have meant frozen pipes, damaged equipment, thousands of dollars in repairs. Instead, everything had returned to normal as if nothing happened. But the sounds from Room C felt different. More active. More aware. Like something had been waiting for the right conditions to make itself known. I fell asleep that night, with Elena's words echoing in my head. Different rules apply to me. What exactly did that mean? And what kind of rules had the Ravenscroft family been following for nearly a century? I was beginning to suspect that winemaking was the least important thing happening at Ravens Hollow Estate. A week passed before Elena assigned me to evening shifts again. This time she paired me with Jake Brennan, a stocky guy from Walla Walla who'd worked 3 harvest seasons at Ravens Hollow. Jake had the easy confidence of someone who'd seen enough strange things to stop being surprised by them. "First rule of night shift," he said, checking his watch as we entered the cellars, "is that time moves different down here. Your phone might say 11 p.m., but this place keeps its own schedule." We started our temperature checks at 8:30 p.m., working through the routine Carmen had taught me. Jake moved with practiced efficiency, recording readings and adjusting equipment with barely a glance at the gauges. But I noticed he gave Tank 7 extra attention, checking not just the temperature display, but also running his hands along the tank's base. "Looking for moisture?" I asked, among other things. He crouched down and examined the concrete floor with his flashlight. "See these dark spots? They show up sometimes after Tank 7 has one of its episodes. Elona thinks they're water stains, but water doesn't usually smell like this. I knelt beside him and caught a whiff of something sweet and rotten, like fruit left too long in the sun. The odor seemed to rise from the concrete itself, as if something had soaked deep into the foundation. "What do you think it is?" Jake stood and wiped his hands on his jeans. "Honestly, I try not to think about it too much. This job pays well, the benefits are good, and Elena's fair to work for. Sometimes the best policy is just to follow the protocols and not ask too many questions." At 10:15 p.m., we settled into the break room for our meal break. Jake had brought homemade tamales from his girlfriend, and the smell of masa and pork filled the small space. We ate in comfortable silence, listening to the building settle around us. "How long have you known Elena?" I asked. "Since she bought this place about 6 years ago. She was different then, more willing to change things, modernize the operation. But after her first November here..." Jake shook his head. "She started asking the old-timers in town about the Ravenscroft family, spent weeks in the county records office, reading through property transfers and newspaper archives." "What did she find?" "Nothing she talks about directly, but she stopped trying to modernize certain parts of the operation, started following protocols that the Ravenscrofts had used for decades. Even hired some equipment specialists to restore those old wooden vats in room C. I thought about the equipment I'd seen through the doorway. Beautifully crafted barrels and fermentation vessels that belonged in the museum. Why restore them if they're just for storage?" Jake finished his tamale and crumpled the foil wrapper. "Who says they're just for storage?" Before I could ask what he meant, we heard it. High-pitched laughter, echoing from somewhere deeper in the building. It sounded like children playing hide-and-seek, their voices bright with excitement and mischief. Jake checked his watch. 10:47 p.m. "Right on schedule," he muttered. The laughter grew louder, joined by the sound of small feet running across wooden floors. But we were sitting in the only occupied part of the building. Everyone else had gone home hours ago. "Rule 2, Jake said, standing up and gathering his trash. "Continue working, don't investigate." "But what if there really are kids in here? What if someone's children wandered in from one of the neighboring farms?" Jake gave me a look that was half pity, half amusement. "Trust me, Trevor, those aren't real children." We resumed our temperature checks, trying to focus on the work while ghostly laughter echoed around us. The sounds seemed to move through the building, sometimes coming from the barrel room, sometimes from areas I knew were empty. Once, I could have sworn I heard small voices singing a song I almost recognized, but the words stayed just beyond comprehension. Jake worked steadily through the routine, apparently unbothered by the supernatural soundtrack. But I noticed his movements had become more economical, more focused. He checked his watch frequently and stayed within arm's reach of the red emergency phone. At 11:30 p.m., we approached Tank 7 for our midnight reading. The display showed normal temperature, 74 degrees Fahrenheit, but something felt different. The air around the tank seemed thicker, and that sweet rotten smell had grown stronger. "Jake, look at this." I pointed to the concrete near the tank's base, where dark stains had appeared since our last check. The spots were wet, as if water had just seeped up through the foundation. Jake knelt and touched one of the stains with his fingertip. When he held it up to his flashlight, the liquid looked dark red, almost purple, like grape juice, but with an oily consistency that clung to his skin. "This is new," he said quietly. The children's laughter had stopped, replaced by a different sound, a slow, rhythmic tapping, like someone drumming fingers against wood. It seemed to come from tank room C, growing louder and more insistent with each repetition. Jake stood up and wiped his finger on his jeans, leaving a dark stain. We need to call Elena. But before we could reach the break room, the lights went out. Complete darkness swallowed the cellar, broken only by the faint glow of digital displays on the tanks. Jake grabbed my arm and guided me toward the wall where emergency equipment was stored. "Red flashlights only," he whispered, his voice tight with tension. "Rule 10, white light attracts attention." His hands fumbled along the wall until he found the emergency kit. 2 red-filtered flashlights clicked on, casting everything in an eerie crimson glow. The familiar cellar had transformed into something alien. Shadows stretched and twisted, and every surface seemed to pulse with the red light. The tapping from room C had grown faster, joined by what sounded like liquids sloshing in large containers. But according to Elena, those wooden vats were empty. "We need to get to the phone," Jake said, his red flashlight beam dancing across the floor as we moved toward the break room. But halfway there, we both stopped. The barrel room, which should have been empty, was filled with shadows that moved wrong. Not the dancing shapes you'd expect from our flashlight beams, but figures that seemed to have their own substance, their own purpose. Small figures. "Oh, hell," Jake breathed. Through the red-tinted darkness, we could see them, children's silhouettes moving between the wine barrels. They appeared to be playing some kind of game, darting behind the large wooden casks and reappearing in different locations. But their movements were too fluid, too quick. And when they turned toward us, their faces were gaps of deeper shadow. "Don't look directly at them," Jake whispered. "Keep moving toward the phone." We edged along the wall, trying to keep our distance from the barrel room while the shadow children continued their play. One of them seemed to notice us and broke away from the group, approaching the doorway between the barrel room and main cellar. It looked like a girl, maybe 8 years old, wearing what appeared to be a Victorian-era dress. Her hair hung in long ringlets, and she moved with the fluid grace of someone walking underwater. But where her face should have been, there was only smooth darkness. She stopped at the threshold and tilted her head, as if studying us with eyes we couldn't see. Then she raised one small hand and waved. Jake's grip on my arm became painful. "Don't wave back. Don't acknowledge her." The shadow girl held her position for several heartbeats, then turned and skipped back to join her companions. The children's laughter resumed, but now it had an edge to it. Less innocent play, more predatory amusement. We reached the break room, and Jake grabbed the red phone with shaking hands. While he dialed Elena's number, I kept watch through the doorway. The shadow children were still playing, but they seemed more agitated now, their movements faster and more erratic. "Elena, it's Jake. We've got a full manifestation. Power's out. Tank 7's leaking something that's not water. And the barrel room." He paused, listening. "Yes, red lights only. We're staying in the break room." He hung up and slumped against the wall. "She's coming. 15 minutes. The children's laughter had stopped again, replaced by a new sound that made my stomach drop. From tank room C came the unmistakable noise of wooden barrels being rolled across a floor, accompanied by the splash of liquid being poured from great heights. "Jake, what's really in room C?" He was quiet for a long moment, his red flashlight beam fixed on the floor. "Elena never told you about the Ravenscroft family's final harvest." "No. 1963. Worst early freeze in Washington history. Killed every vine on the property in a single night. The family had just finished their harvest, the best vintage they'd ever produced, according to the records. 30,000 gallons of wine aging in those wooden vats. The rolling sounds from room C grew louder, more frantic. But the freeze didn't just kill the vines. It trapped the family in the cellars during the tasting event. 23 people, including 5 children from the extended family. They were found 3 days later when the roads cleared. I felt that sweet, rotten smell growing stronger, seeping through the walls from somewhere deeper in the building. What happened to them? Carbon dioxide poisoning. The fermentation process in those old wooden vats produces CO2, and in a sealed space. Jake shrugged. They just went to sleep. And the wine? Still aging in those vats when Elena bought the property. She had it tested, still perfectly preserved, maybe the finest vintage ever produced in Washington state, worth a fortune to collectors. The liquid sounds from room C reached a crescendo, then stopped abruptly. The building fell silent, except for the hum of cooling equipment and our own breathing. Elena could never bring herself to sell it, Jake continued. Says the wine belongs here, with the family that made it. So she restored the vats and moved the vintage back to room C. 30,000 gallons of 1963 Ravenscroft Reserve, still aging after 60 years. Headlights swept through the break room window as Elena's truck pulled into the parking lot. But I barely noticed, because I finally understood what we'd been hearing all night. The Ravenscroft family was still working their final harvest, still tending wine that would never be finished, never be sold, never be consumed by anyone except the shadows that had once been children playing in a cellar that became their tomb. And somehow, I knew our work here was just beginning. Elena entered the cellars carrying equipment I'd never seen before. A leather satchel filled with glass vials, a brass compass that looked antique, and something wrapped in black cloth that she handled with extraordinary care. She moved through the darkness with confidence, as if the red emergency lighting was perfectly adequate for her purposes. "Power's been out for 20 minutes, Jake reported, his voice steadier now that she was here. Expected. Tank 7's episodes always affect the electrical systems. Elena set her satchel on the break room table and began removing items with practiced efficiency. The manifestation in the barrel room, full materialization or just shadows? Full materialization. We saw a girl maybe 8 years old. Victorian dress, long hair. She waved at us. Elena paused in her unpacking. Waved? Yeah. Trevor almost waved back, but I stopped him. Good. Elena pulled a glass vial from the satchel, filled with what looked like ordinary water but smelled faintly of herbs. Physical interaction with the manifestations creates complications. They start expecting acknowledgement, start demanding it. She handed Jake and me each a small cloth bag that felt warm to the touch. Keep these in your pockets while we work. They'll help mask your presence from anything that shouldn't be here. What's in them? I asked. Grape seeds from the 1962 harvest, blessed sage, and a few other things the Ravenscroft family used. Elena unwrapped the black cloth, revealing an ornate silver key about 6 inches long. Isabella Ravenscroft kept detailed records of her family's methods. This key was hers. The silver gleamed even in the red light, covered with engravings too intricate to make out clearly. But looking at it made me feel oddly dizzy, like staring at an optical illusion. Methods for what? Managing the relationship between the living and the dead. Elena tucked the key into her jacket pocket. The Ravenscrofts understood that some places hold onto their history more strongly than others. This land, these cellars, they're like a recording device that never stops playing. From the barrel room came the sound of children whispering, their voices too quiet to understand but loud enough to raise goosebumps along my arms. Elena listened for a moment, then nodded as if the whispers made perfect sense. They're more active tonight than usual. The temperature drop must have triggered something. She picked up her compass and watched the needle spin wildly before settling on a direction that definitely wasn't magnetic north. Jake, I need you to check Tank 7's foundation readings. Trevor, you're coming with me to room C." "Is that safe?" Jake asked. "Safer than leaving it unattended. Whatever's happening in there tonight, it needs to be contained before morning." Elena gathered her equipment. The compass will tell us if we're dealing with residual energy or something more intentional. We left Jake testing equipment around Tank 7 and approached the locked door of room C. Elena produced the silver key, and it slid into the lock like it belonged there, despite the fact that the door had been secured with a modern deadbolt. The Ravenscrofts had this room built specifically for their reserve wines, Elena explained as she turned the key. Isabella designed it according to principles her grandmother brought from the old country. Certain proportions, specific materials. It's not just storage, it's a containment system. The lock clicked open, and Elena pushed the door wide. The wooden vats inside were no longer silent. We could hear liquid moving within them, not the gentle aging process of normal wine, but something more active, like fermentation was happening in fast forward. "The 1963 vintage?" I asked, among other things. Elena stepped into the room, her red flashlight revealing details I'd missed during our brief earlier visit. The wooden vats were arranged in a specific pattern, connected by copper tubing that ran beneath the floor. At the center of the room sat a smaller barrel, made from different wood and carved with symbols that hurt to look at directly. Isabella Ravenscroft was what people today might call a wine witch, Elena said, checking readings on her brass compass. She understood that fermentation is fundamentally about transformation. Sugar into alcohol, grape juice into wine. But transformation can work both ways. She approached the central barrel and placed her hand flat against its curved surface. The wood was dark with age, almost black, and seemed to absorb our red flashlight beams rather than reflect them. "This contains the last wine the family made together, pressed from grapes picked on the morning they died, fermented with their final breath still in the air." Elena's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. Isabella believed that under the right conditions, wine could hold more than flavor and alcohol. It could hold memory, emotion, even consciousness. The liquid sounds around us grew louder, and I realized the connected vats were somehow communicating with each other through the copper tubing. Wine was flowing between them in patterns that made no sense for normal storage. "You're saying the wine is alive?" "I'm saying the boundary between life and death isn't as solid as most people believe. And places like this, where tragedy and beauty intersect, sometimes those boundaries become permeable." Elena pulled the silver key from her pocket and inserted it into a small lock on the central barrel. She turned it slowly, and the flowing sounds throughout the room grew quieter, more controlled. Isabella designed this system to contain what she created, wine infused with the spiritual essence of everyone who died that night. It was meant to preserve them, to give them a form of immortality through their craft. Eleanor removed the key and the sounds stopped entirely. But preservation and peace aren't the same thing. We stood in complete silence for several heartbeats. Then, from deeper in the building, came Jake's voice calling for help. We hurried back to Tank 7, where Jake was standing in a pool of that dark purple liquid, his boots soaked through. The substance was seeping up through cracks in the concrete foundation, spreading across the floor in patterns that looked almost like writing. "Started about 5 minutes ago," Jake said, backing away from the expanding puddle. "Temperature gauge is going crazy, jumping between 32 and 90 degrees every few seconds." Elena examined the liquid with her flashlight, but kept her distance. "It's overflow from the containment system. The spiritual activity tonight is stronger than usual." "Spiritual activity?" I asked. the Ravenscroft family is trying to expand beyond Room C. They've been contained for 60 years, but wine continues to age, continues to change. Their consciousness has been fermenting all this time, growing stronger and more concentrated. She pulled out her phone and checked the time. 12:47 a.m. We're approaching the hour when they died. The activity always peaks then. As if summoned by her words, the children's laughter returned, but now it sounded different, less playful, more hungry. The shadow children appeared in the barrel room doorway, but instead of playing among themselves, they were watching us with obvious interest. "Elena," Jake said quietly, "they've never approached this close before." She was right. The shadow children were no longer content to stay in the barrel room. They were moving into the main cellar, gliding between the modern stainless steel tanks like they owned the place, which, in a way, they probably did. The girl in the Victorian dress was leading them, her dark face turned toward Elena with unmistakable recognition. She raised her small hand again, but this time it wasn't a wave. It was a gesture of invitation. "They want us to follow them," Elena said, her voice carefully neutral. "Follow them where?" Elena checked her brass compass. The needle was spinning frantically, unable to find any stable direction. "Somewhere we've never been invited before." The shadow children turned and began moving toward a section of the cellar I'd thought was just storage, stacked wine cases and old equipment. But as they approached, I could see something I'd missed, a gap between the storage items, just wide enough for a person to squeeze through. "There's another room back there," I realized. Elena nodded grimly. The original root cellar, where it all started. The Victorian girl looked back at us one more time, her shadow face tilting in what might have been a smile. Then she and her companions disappeared through the gap, leaving us alone with the sound of our own breathing and the steady drip of purple liquid spreading across the concrete floor. "Well," Elena said, securing her equipment, "I guess we're about to find out what the Ravenscroft family has been preparing for the last 60 years. Elena led us toward the gap between the storage cases, her red flashlight revealing the narrow passage that sloped downward into darkness. The walls were carved from living rock, older than anything else in the building, and they wept with moisture that smelled of earth and decay. This passage connects to the original root cellar," Elena explained, squeezing through the opening. "Isabella Ravenscroft had it sealed in 1964, a year after the tragedy. But sealing something and destroying it aren't the same thing." Jake followed her, then me, our footsteps echoing strangely in the confined space. The air grew thicker as we descended, heavy with the scent of fermentation and something else, something organic and sweet that reminded me of flowers left too long in water. "How do you know so much about Isabella Ravenscroft?" I asked. "Because she left detailed records, not just winemaking notes, but documentation of everything she was experimenting with. The County Historical Society has boxes of her journals, including specifications for this containment system." Elena paused at a curve in the passage, checking her compass. She knew what she was creating down here might outlive her family. She wanted future generations to understand how to manage it. The passage opened into a circular chamber carved entirely from basalt bedrock. The ceiling arched overhead, supported by pillars that looked like they'd grown from the stone itself rather than been carved. But it was what filled the chamber that made me stop breathing. Hundreds of wine bottles lined the walls, each one glowing with soft purple light that pulsed like a heartbeat. They were arranged in precise patterns, connected by thin copper wires that created a complex web throughout the chamber. At the center sat a massive wooden barrel, easily 10 feet tall, made from wood so dark it seemed to absorb light. "The heart of Isabella's system," Elena whispered. This is where the 1963 vintage was originally fermented, where the family's consciousness was first captured. The shadow children stood around the central barrel, no longer playing but arranged in formal positions like they were attending a ceremony. The Victorian girl was closest to the barrel, her small hands pressed against its curved surface. As we entered the chamber, all the shadow children turned toward us simultaneously. Their faces remained featureless voids, but I could feel their attention like weight pressing against my chest. "They're waiting for something," Jake observed. Elena approached the central barrel carefully, her equipment ready. The brass compass in her hand was spinning so rapidly, the needle looked like a blur. The anniversary is in 6 hours. October 23rd, 1:15 a.m., the exact moment the family died. That's when the spiritual energy peaks, when the barrier between their world and ours becomes thinnest. She placed her hand on the barrel's surface, and the purple glow from the bottles intensified. Through the wood, we could hear liquid moving, but not the gentle aging process of normal wine. This sounded active, purposeful, like something swimming in the depths of the barrel. "What are they planning?" I asked. "Emergence." For 60 years, they've been contained in wine, existing as pure consciousness without physical form. But wine continues to ferment, continues to change. They've been growing stronger, more concentrated, learning how to manipulate matter from the spiritual realm. Elena pulled out one of her glass vials and poured its contents, that herb-scented water, in a circle around the base of the barrel. Where the liquid touched the stone floor, it hissed and steamed like acid. Isabella built this system to preserve them, but she also included safeguards, ways to strengthen the containment when necessary. Elena completed the circle, and the shadow children stepped back, their forms becoming less solid. The question is whether those safeguards are still strong enough after 6 decades of spiritual fermentation. The Victorian girl raised her head and opened her mouth. No sound emerged, but somehow I heard her voice inside my skull, clear as speaking, but coming from somewhere behind my thoughts. "We've been waiting so long." Jake grabbed my arm, his face pale in the red light. "Did you hear that? We want to taste again, to breathe again, to feel sunshine on faces that remember warmth." Elena's hand tightened around the silver key. "They're trying to communicate directly. Don't respond. Don't even think responses. Mental contact makes the containment weaker." But the voices were already flooding my mind. Not just the girl, but all of them. Men, women, children. Their thoughts mixing together like harmonies in a choir. The wine holds us, but wine is meant to be shared, meant to be consumed, meant to transform those who drink it. "That's their plan," Elena said grimly. "They want someone to drink the 1963 vintage, to complete the circuit between the spiritual and physical realms. Just one sip, one small taste, and we can show you wonders beyond imagining. The knowledge of 60 years spent conscious but bodiless. The wisdom of existing between life and death." The bottles lining the walls pulsed brighter, and I could see shapes moving within the wine, not sediment or fermentation debris, but forms that looked almost human. Faces pressed against the glass from inside, mouths moving in silent words. "Trevor, don't look at the bottles," Elena commanded. "Focus on my voice, not theirs." "We are not asking for much. We offer fair trade, knowledge for freedom, experience for emergence. All we need is one willing participant to bridge the gap." The central barrel began to vibrate, wood creaking under pressure from within. Liquid seeped through the joints between staves, that same purple substance we'd seen in the main cellar, but thicker here, more viscous. "The containment is failing," Jake said, backing toward the passage entrance. Elena was working frantically with her equipment, pouring different liquids around the barrel and muttering words in a language I didn't recognize. But the purple seepage was spreading, flowing across the stone floor in streams that moved uphill, defying gravity. Time grows short. The anniversary approaches. We can offer you anything: wealth, knowledge, experiences beyond mortal comprehension. But we must have willing participation. The barrier cannot be crossed through force. Why willing participation? I asked, then immediately regretted speaking. Elena whirled around, her eyes wide with fear. Because you just gave them permission to negotiate. The shadow children moved closer, no longer maintaining their respectful distance from Elena's protective circle. The Victorian girl reached toward me, her small hand extending from darkness into the red light of our flashlights. Because transformation requires consent. Wine changes grape juice willingly. Fermentation is a partnership between fruit and yeast, each giving what the other needs. We offer the same partnership. Her fingers almost touched mine before Jake yanked me backward. Where her shadow hand had passed through the air, purple mist lingered like smoke. We have waited so long, Trevor Haskell. We know your name, your history, your desires. You came here seeking something better than washing dishes in Spokane. We can give you purpose beyond imagining. Elena had completed some kind of ritual around the barrel, but the voices in my head were growing stronger, more persuasive. The knowledge they offered felt tangible. I could sense vast libraries of experience waiting just beyond my reach. The wine contained 60 years of consciousness, concentrated and refined. One sip would expand your awareness beyond mortal limitations. You would see through our eyes, understand mysteries that have puzzled humanity for millennia. Trevor. Elena's voice seemed to come from very far away. The key. I need you to help me lock down the system. But the shadow children were surrounding me now, their void faces turned upward with expressions I somehow recognized as hopeful. They weren't trying to frighten or harm. They were pleading, desperate for release from their liquid prison. We are not evil, Trevor. We are simply trapped. Imagine being conscious but unable to taste, unable to touch, unable to feel anything except the slow burn of fermentation for 60 years. Would you not also beg for freedom? The central barrel was leaking more rapidly now, purple wine pooling around its base, despite Elena's protective circle. The liquid seemed alive, reaching toward me with tentacle-like streams that defied every law of physics I understood. One sip is all we ask. One small taste to complete the transformation that began so long ago. We will share everything. Every secret learned during our long imprisonment. Every revelation discovered in the space between life and death. I found myself walking toward the barrel, my hand reaching for the purple liquid that offered so much more than wine. The knowledge they promised felt real, tangible, worth any price they might ask. Yes, come closer. Let us show you what we have learned about the nature of consciousness itself, about the thin barriers that separate matter from spirit, life from death, mortal understanding from divine wisdom. Elena was shouting something, but her words seemed muffled, distant. Jake was pulling on my arm, but his grip felt weak against the gravity of what the shadow children offered. The Victorian girl was beside me now, her small hand guiding mine toward the seeping wine. Her touch felt like cold electricity, but not unpleasant, more like the shock of recognition, of finding something I'd been searching for without knowing it. Just one sip, Trevor. One small taste of what we have become. And then you will understand why we have waited so long for someone like you. Someone desperate enough to listen, brave enough to participate, willing enough to transform. My fingers touched the purple liquid, and the world exploded into sensation and memory and knowledge that human minds were never meant to contain. And somewhere, very far away, I heard Elena screaming my name. The moment my skin made contact with the purple wine, reality shattered into fragments of memory that weren't mine. I was suddenly Isabella Ravenscroft, standing in this same chamber in 1963, watching my family taste the final vintage while October frost killed our vines outside. I felt her desperation as she realized the wine had become something more than fermented grapes. It had become a vessel for consciousness itself. Then I was her grandfather, Pietro, who'd brought the old country knowledge to Washington soil, teaching his granddaughter about wine that could hold more than flavor. I experienced his fear as he understood what Isabella was creating, how fermentation could preserve not just fruit, but the very essence of human awareness. Through dozens of eyes, I watched the family's final moments. The gradual drowsiness as carbon dioxide filled the sealed chamber. The peaceful acceptance as they drifted into sleep, their consciousness flowing into wine that had been prepared specifically to receive it. Their last thoughts becoming the first vintage of what Isabella called memory wine. But underneath these borrowed memories was something else, a hungry intelligence that had been growing for 60 years, fed by spiritual fermentation and the concentrated essence of 23 trapped souls. It recognized me as a potential host, a bridge between their liquid prison and the physical world they desperately wanted to rejoin. Yes, whispered voices that were now inside my head rather than external. You understand now. We are not dead. We are transformed, and we can share this transformation with you. My hand was sinking deeper into the purple liquid, which felt warm and oddly alive. Where it touched my skin, I could feel my consciousness expanding, stretching beyond the boundaries of my physical body. I was aware of Jake grabbing my shoulders, of Elena frantically working with her silver key. But they seemed distant and disconnected from what was happening to me. We have learned so much during our imprisonment. How to exist without flesh. How to manipulate matter through will alone. How to perceive the hidden connections between all living things. This knowledge can be yours. The wine was climbing up my arm now, not flowing like liquid but moving with purpose, seeking more contact with my skin. Through my expanding awareness, I could sense the entire underground chamber, every bottle, every copper wire, every shadow child watching with hopeful anticipation. Trevor, Elena's voice cut through the supernatural whispers. Fight them. They're trying to use you as an anchor point. But fighting felt impossible when the knowledge they offered was so intoxicating. I could see the molecular structure of the wine, understand how Isabella had used specific fermentation techniques to create a medium capable of holding human consciousness. I could perceive the copper wiring as a complex circuit designed to maintain spiritual cohesion across multiple vessels. You could help us modernize the system, the voices suggested. Your knowledge of contemporary technology combined with our understanding of consciousness preservation. Together, we could perfect what Isabella began. Elena appeared beside me, her hands glowing with that herb-scented water. When she touched my wine-covered arm, steam rose and the purple liquid recoiled like it had been burned. Blessed water with grape seeds from the 1962 harvest, she explained through gritted teeth. It disrupts their connection to host consciousness. The pain of separation was immediate and intense. The borrowed memories began fragmenting, leaving gaps in my awareness where vast knowledge had briefly resided. The shadow children cried out in voices that sounded like wind through empty bottles. Do not take him from us. We need willing participation. We must have a bridge to the physical realm. Elena was pulling me away from the central barrel, but the wine on my arm was fighting back, trying to burrow deeper into my skin. Where it had touched, my flesh felt different, more sensitive, more aware of temperature and texture and the electrical activity of my nervous system. "Jake, help me get him to the passage," Elena shouted. But Jake was staring at something behind us, his face pale with terror. "Elena, look." The hundreds of bottles lining the chamber walls were beginning to crack. Purple wine seeped through the fractures, and within each bottle, I could see faces pressing against the glass with increasing desperation. The copper wiring was sparking, overloaded by spiritual energy that had been building toward this moment for decades. "The containment system is failing," Elena said, her voice tight with fear. "They're trying to force an emergence." "You cannot stop what has already begun," the voices declared, no longer just in my head but echoing through the chamber itself. "The anniversary approaches. Our time of release has arrived." Elena checked her watch. 12:58 a.m. 17 minutes until the moment they died. If they break free during the anniversary window, the spiritual energy will be strong enough to give them permanent physical form. More bottles cracked, sending purple wine streaming across the stone floor. The shadow children were becoming more solid, their Victorian-era clothing gaining texture and detail. I could see the Victorian girl's face now, pale skin, dark eyes, and a smile that was both innocent and predatory. "What happens if they get physical form?" I asked, still feeling the wine's influence in my blood. 23 conscious entities with 60 years of accumulated knowledge and power, unlimited by human morality or physical limitations. Elena was working frantically with her equipment, pouring different substances around the chamber's perimeter. They could reproduce what Isabella created here on a massive scale, turn wine regions across the world into consciousness farms. The central barrel was splitting now, thick streams of purple wine pouring onto the stone floor. Within the liquid, I could see shapes moving. Not the shadow children, but adult forms. The rest of the Ravenscroft family, preparing to emerge from their long imprisonment. "We offer you a place in the new world we will create," the voices whispered, still speaking directly into my mind, despite Elena's intervention. "You have tasted our nature. You understand what we can become together." But the knowledge was fading from my consciousness, leaving behind only fragments and an overwhelming sense of loss. I could remember glimpses of vast understanding, but not the understanding itself, like trying to recall a dream after waking. Elena produced the silver key and approached the central barrel despite the streams of wine flowing around its base. Isabella included an emergency containment protocol, a way to reinforce the system if the spiritual energy became too strong. She inserted the key into a hidden lock near the barrel's base and began turning it slowly. The chamber filled with a low humming sound, and the copper wiring began glowing with pale blue light. "You cannot imprison us forever," the voices said, but now they sounded strained, distant. "We have learned too much, grown too strong. This containment is temporary." "Maybe," Elena agreed, continuing to turn the key. "But temporary might be enough." The wine on the floor began flowing backward, drawn by some force I couldn't understand. The shadow children were becoming translucent again, their desperate reaching hands passing through air instead of grasping physical matter. But the Victorian girl managed one final communication, her voice clear in my mind. "Remember what you felt, Trevor Haskell. Remember the knowledge we shared. When you dream of wine, you will dream of us. And dreams are another kind of bridge." The key clicked into its final position, and the chamber fell silent. The purple wine retreated into the cracked bottles. The copper wiring stopped sparking, and the shadow children faded back into barely visible outlines. Elena slumped against the wall, exhausted. The emergency containment will hold until dawn, but this was just a rehearsal. They're getting stronger every year. Jake helped me to my feet, and I realized my arm where the wine had touched was still tingling, still hypersensitive to every sensation. Will it wear off? I don't know. No one's ever made direct contact with the 1963 vintage before. Elena gathered her equipment with shaking hands. Isabella's notes don't cover this situation. As we prepared to leave the chamber, I looked back at the central barrel. It appeared intact again, the cracks sealed as if they'd never existed. But I could still hear something moving inside. Patient. Waiting. Planning. Next year, whispered a voice that might have been my own thoughts or might have been something else entirely. Next anniversary, we will be ready. We climbed back through the narrow passage toward the main cellar, but I knew something fundamental had changed. The wine's influence might be fading, but it had left marks on my consciousness that would never fully heal. And somewhere in the back of my mind, I could still taste purple wine that held 60 years of accumulated knowledge, waiting for the next opportunity to share its gifts with a willing recipient. The protocols suddenly made perfect sense. Some rules weren't meant to be broken. They were meant to keep ancient hungers from finding new hosts. By the time we reached the main cellar, the lights had come back on. The purple liquid that had seeped from Tank 7 was gone, leaving only faint stains on the concrete that could have been ordinary grape juice. Everything looked normal, mundane even, as if the events in the root cellar had happened in another world entirely. But I could still feel the wine's influence coursing through my veins. My senses had become hyperacute. I could smell the individual bacteria strains in each fermenting tank, hear the minute temperature fluctuations in the cooling systems, even perceive the electrical patterns running through the building's wiring. It was overwhelming and fascinating in equal measure. "How do you feel?" Elena asked, watching me with concern. "Different. Like I'm picking up signals I've never noticed before." I touched my arm where the wine had made contact. The skin looked normal, but it felt charged, alive in a way that made me acutely aware of my pulse, my breathing, the electrical firing of neurons. Jake was checking his equipment, trying to restore some sense of normalcy. Tank 7's reading normal temperature again. 74 degrees, steady as clockwork. But I could sense something Jake's instruments couldn't detect. Tank 7 wasn't just monitoring wine, it was monitoring something deeper, connected to the root cellar through pathways that existed below the foundation. The tank was part of Isabella's larger system, a component in a network designed to manage spiritual energy. "Helena," I said slowly, "Tank 7 isn't really for wine storage, is it?" She stopped gathering her equipment and fixed me with a sharp look. "What makes you say that?" "I can feel it. There's something underneath, connected to the root cellar through channels in the bedrock. Tank 7 is like a pressure valve, releasing spiritual energy when the containment system gets overloaded." Elena's expression grew troubled. "That kind of perception shouldn't be possible. The wine contact should have worn off by now." But the awareness was only growing stronger. I could sense the shadow children still moving through the building, no longer visible but leaving traces of their presence like footprints in the air. They were drawn to me now, recognizing something familiar in my modified consciousness. "They changed me, didn't they?" I asked. "I don't know." Isabella's notes mentioned something called bridging, a partial transformation that allows consciousness to exist simultaneously in physical and spiritual realms, but she never described the process in detail. Jake looked up from his instruments. "Is that good or bad?" "Unknown," Elena admitted. "Isabella only attempted bridging once, with her youngest daughter Maria. The experiment was inconclusive." I felt a presence approaching and turned toward the barrel room. The Victorian girl was there, still translucent, but more solid than before. She wasn't moving like a shadow anymore. She was walking, stepping carefully around the wine barrels as if they were physical obstacles she needed to navigate. "She's getting stronger," I observed. Elena followed my gaze but shook her head. "I don't see anything." "That's because you haven't been bridged. I can see them clearly now. All of them. They're everywhere in this building, going about routines they established 60 years ago." I pointed toward areas where other shadow figures moved through their eternal tasks. "There's a man in overalls checking barrel temperatures that don't exist anymore. A woman taking notes on fermentation that finished decades ago." The Victorian girl noticed my attention and approached the doorway between the barrel room and main cellar. When she spoke, her voice came not through mental communication, but as actual sound, thin and distant, but unmistakably real. "You can see us now," she said, her dark eyes bright with hope. "You understand what we've become." Elena grabbed my arm. "Don't respond. Direct communication will strengthen the bridge." But ignoring her felt cruel, especially when I could see the loneliness in the girl's expression. She'd been trapped here for 60 years, watching the living world continue without her, unable to participate or even be acknowledged. "What's your name?" I asked. "Trevor." "No," Elena warned. "Maria," the girl replied. And suddenly I understood. This was Isabella's daughter, the one who'd undergone the bridging experiment. "Mama tried to save me first, but the wine wasn't ready. I've been caught between worlds ever since." The adult shadow figures were gathering now, drawn by the sound of conversation between the living and the dead. I could see the family resemblance in their faces. The strong jawline of the Ravenscroft patriarch, the delicate features of Isabella's sisters, the weathered hands of vineyard workers who'd spent decades tending grapes. "They've been waiting for someone like you," Maria continued. "Someone who could bridge the gap, help us complete what Mama started." Elena was working frantically with her equipment, but I could sense her protective measures becoming less effective. The bridge between realms was strengthening with each word I exchanged with the spirits, making them more real, and me more like them. "What did Isabella want to accomplish?" I asked. "Preservation of knowledge, wine-making techniques that took generations to perfect, family wisdom that would die with us." Maria stepped closer, and I could see tears on her translucent cheeks. But something went wrong. Instead of preserving just knowledge, the wine captured our consciousness. We became trapped in fermentation that never ends. Through my enhanced awareness, I could perceive the entire network Isabella had created. The root cellar was just the heart of a system that extended throughout the property, with copper conductors running under the vineyards and connection points hidden in seemingly innocent equipment. The whole estate is wired, I realized. Every vine, every building, all connected to the consciousness preservation network. Elena stopped her work and stared at me. "That's impossible. I've surveyed every inch of this property." "Not with bridged perception. I can see pathways you can't detect, energy flows that exist between physical and spiritual realms." I pointed toward areas where copper lines ran beneath the floor. Isabella didn't just want to preserve her family. She wanted to create a permanent connection between the living and the dead, using wine as the medium. The shadow figures were becoming more solid with each moment, their forms gaining detail and substance. I could smell the lavender soap Isabella's sisters had favored, hear the specific creaking of boots worn by the vineyard workers, even feel the emotional resonance of family bonds that transcended death. "But why wine?" Jake asked, apparently able to hear Maria's voice now that the bridge was strengthening. Because fermentation is transformation, Maria explained. Grape juice becomes wine through controlled death, the breaking down of sugars, the conversion of one form of life into another. Mama understood that consciousness could undergo similar transformation if the conditions were right. Elena checked her watch. 1:10 a.m. 5 minutes until the anniversary moment. Whatever's going to happen will happen then. I could feel the spiritual energy building throughout the estate, drawn toward this moment when the barrier between worlds would be at its thinnest. The shadow figures were preparing for something, arranging themselves in positions that seemed meaningful within their supernatural routine. They're not trying to escape, I realized. They're trying to complete the transformation Isabella started. What do you mean? Elena asked. Through my bridged awareness, I could perceive the network's true purpose. Isabella hadn't designed a prison. She'd designed a chrysalis, a system that would allow consciousness to transform completely, emerging not as trapped spirits, but as something entirely new. Isabella was trying to create a new form of existence. Not fully alive, not fully dead, but something that could move freely between both states. The containment wasn't meant to be permanent. It was meant to be preparation. Maria nodded, her form now solid enough to cast shadows in the electric light. 60 years of fermentation. 60 years of transformation. We're ready now to emerge as what Mama intended us to become. The building began to vibrate, a low harmonic resonance that seemed to come from the bedrock itself. Every piece of metal equipment was humming, every glass surface resonating with the same frequency. Through the windows, I could see the vineyard itself beginning to glow with soft purple light as the underground network activated. 1:15 a.m., Elena announced, her voice barely audible over the harmonic resonance. The moment of anniversary had arrived, and the Ravenscroft family was finally ready to complete their 6-decade transformation. But as the spiritual energy reached its peak, I realized something that filled me with both wonder and terror. I wasn't just witnessing their emergence. I was part of it. The bridging had made me a component in Isabella's system, and now I was being drawn into a transformation I didn't fully understand. The wine was calling me home. The morning sun streams through my studio window, but I no longer need sleep. Haven't since the anniversary night, when Isabella's system completed its 60-year cycle and drew me fully into the bridge between worlds. Elena found my body at dawn, breathing but unresponsive, my consciousness split between flesh and fermentation. I exist now in both realms simultaneously, physically tending the vines during daylight hours, spiritually managing the underground network when darkness falls. The Ravenscroft family didn't escape their wine prison. They transformed it into something magnificent, and I've become their willing partner in maintaining this delicate balance. Elena still works the estate, though she understands now that she was never truly the owner. She was the caretaker, preparing the way for what Isabella always intended, a permanent guardian who could bridge the gap between the living vineyard and the conscious wine that flows beneath it. The protocols have evolved. New rules emerge as I learn to navigate my dual existence. Never taste the current vintage before consulting with the 1963 consciousness. The old wine has become a library of every technique, every secret, every innovation the Ravenscroft family accumulated across generations. They guide modern winemaking with knowledge that spans beyond death. Monitor the temperature fluctuations in Tank 7 with both instruments and enhanced perception. The tank serves as a communication node, allowing the underground consciousness to influence the physical equipment when necessary. Document any visitors who show sensitivity to the spiritual network. Some people, like I was, possess natural bridging potential. The family is always seeking new partners in their expanding enterprise. Maria visits me each evening, teaching me how to perceive the copper pathways that run beneath neighboring vineyards. Isabella's network wasn't confined to Ravens Hollow Estate. It extends throughout the Horse Heaven Hills, connecting to other properties whose owners never suspected they were part of a larger design. We're not the only wine family to discover consciousness preservation, Maria explained during one of our tutorials. Mama corresponded with vignerons from France, from Italy, from regions where winemaking traditions stretch back millennia. The knowledge exists wherever grapes grow old enough to hold memory. My enhanced awareness reveals the truth behind Washington's wine boom. How many estates were built on land where indigenous peoples held their own fermentation ceremonies? How many cellars contain networks similar to Isabella's, activated by accident or design? The transformation hasn't been without cost. My relationship with the physical world grows more tenuous each day. Food tastes like memory, rather than sustenance. Human conversation feels shallow compared to the deep communication possible through wine consciousness. I find myself spending more time in the root cellar, learning from 60 years of accumulated wisdom, than in my apartment above the tasting room. But the knowledge is intoxicating. Through the network, I can perceive the molecular structure of fermenting wine, understand the relationship between soil chemistry and great consciousness, even influence weather patterns that affect the vineyard. The Ravenscroft family has taught me that death isn't the end of learning. It's the beginning of a different kind of education. Elena hired a new cellar hand last week, a young woman from Oregon with calloused hands and desperate eyes, running from something she won't discuss. I've been watching her reaction to the protocols, noting how she pauses near tank 7, how she seems to hear whispers others miss. The family is interested in her potential. Tonight, I'll introduce her to the revised protocols, the rules that acknowledge what Ravens Hollow Estate has always been. Not just a winery, but a school for consciousness that transcends the boundaries between life, death, and fermentation. Some traditions are worth preserving, regardless of the price, and some bridges, once built, are meant to carry traffic in both directions.